The game ended before it even began.
The night that set everything in motion started innocently enough. One of those expensive charity galas that corporations love to sponsor. The kind where tickets cost more than most people's monthly rent. Crystal chandeliers that probably cost six figures. Champagne flowing like water from fountains. A legitimate string quartet playing Vivaldi in the corner of this absurdly expensive ballroom with marble floors and gold-trimmed everything. I'd actually been the one to suggest we attend together, thinking maybe a fancy night out would help bridge the growing distance between us. Jennifer had been cold lately, increasingly focused on her career, her network, her advancement. The warmth we'd once shared had evaporated over the past 18 months, replaced by this professional calculation that seemed to govern every interaction. I genuinely thought maybe reminding her that we were supposed to be partners might help. I was spectacularly, devastatingly wrong about that. We were seated at one of those enormous circular tables that seat 12 people, surrounded by the entire corporate hierarchy. My direct supervisor, Darren, was there, looking uncomfortable in a rented tuxedo. The VP of operations sat 2 seats down, checking his phone every 30 seconds. 3 board members occupied the premium seats, including this older gentleman named Mr. Harrison, a former Navy officer in his early 70s, who had this unsettling habit of watching everyone with the kind of attention that missed absolutely nothing. Everyone was engaged in that particular brand of forced polite conversation that happens at corporate events, discussing quarterly earnings projections and market volatility, while cutting into steaks that cost more than I used to make in a week when I first started at this company. Then, Jennifer decided it was time for her performance. Her voice sliced through the ambient noise like a blade, loud enough that people 3 tables away probably heard every word. Still sitting in the same analyst position after 13 years now? That's genuinely impressive in its own way, babe. Most people would have either been promoted or fired by this point in their career. The entire table fell into immediate, suffocating silence. Forks froze in midair. Someone's knife scraped against their plate, painfully loud in the sudden quiet. The waiter who'd been pouring wine for the person next to me actually stopped mid-pour, bottle hovering uncertainly. Even the string quartet seemed to stumble over a note, the music faltering for just a moment. I didn't react, didn't turn my head to look at her, didn't make eye contact with anyone else at the table. Just methodically adjusted my cufflinks with deliberate precision, took another measured sip of the ridiculously overpriced Cabernet they'd paired with the main course, and continued chewing. Slow, controlled. Like a man who hadn't just been publicly gutted by his own spouse in front of everyone who had any influence over his professional future. Jennifer has always been a natural performer, someone who feeds off audience reaction. She leaned back in her chair with this satisfied grin, like she'd just delivered the punchline to the world's funniest joke and was waiting for applause. Come on, you all know I'm just teasing. But seriously, it's been 13 years in the same role. That has to be approaching some kind of corporate longevity record, right? Most people get restless, want to move up, take on new challenges, but not my husband. He's the definition of consistent. A few nervous, uncomfortable laughs came from the junior staff members seated at the far end of the table. That particular kind of laughter people produce when they're not sure whether they're supposed to find something funny or horrifying, when they're trying to gauge which response will keep them safe. My supervisor, Darren, was staring at the elaborate floral centerpiece like he'd discovered the secrets of the universe hidden in the arrangement. The VP had suddenly become completely fascinated by his phone, scrolling through something with intense focus. The board members maintained neutral expressions, but I could see the subtle shift in their posture, the slight narrowing of eyes. Nobody made eye contact with me. Nobody said a single word in my defense. Nobody attempted to deflect or change the subject, except for Mr. Harrison. He tilted his head slightly, studying me with this calculating, analytical expression, like he was conducting some kind of assessment, gathering data, forming conclusions. I caught his gaze just long enough to give him the smallest possible nod, barely perceptible, just a minor movement of my head. He didn't smile, didn't look away, just continued watching with that unsettling intensity. Jennifer lifted her wine glass in an elaborate mock toast, her voice carrying across the entire section of the ballroom. To my wonderful, dependable husband, the most consistent, reliable man in middle management. You can't get fired if you never take any risks, and you definitely can't get promoted if you never make any waves. Here's to playing it safe. More uncomfortable laughter rippled around our table and probably several nearby tables. Someone coughed awkwardly. Another person suddenly became very interested in their dessert menu. The string quartet had definitely stopped playing entirely now, the musicians exchanging uncertain glances. I set down my fork with careful precision, dabbed my mouth with the cloth napkin in a gesture of perfect formal etiquette, and still maintained complete composure. Then I stood up smoothly, excused myself with quiet politeness, mentioned something about needing to take an important phone call that couldn't wait. Jennifer didn't even register my departure, didn't track my movement or acknowledge I was leaving. She'd already pivoted to the CFO's wife, launching into some animated story about market disruption and innovation strategies. I walked through the glass-walled reception hall with its floor-to-ceiling windows, down the ornate metal staircase with its Art Deco railings, out into the cool October evening where the air smelled like approaching rain and the lavender planted in the hotel's expensive landscaping. I didn't pull out my phone, didn't call anyone, didn't text. Just sat on the edge of a concrete planter near the valet parking area, methodically rolled up my sleeves, loosened my tie completely. My hands were perfectly steady. My heart rate was completely normal. I wasn't angry, which might seem strange to anyone hearing this story, but anger comes from being surprised, and I hadn't been genuinely surprised by Jennifer's behavior in years. This moment, this public humiliation, had been building inevitably toward this exact outcome. I'd seen it coming from miles away. Here's what absolutely nobody at that table understood, what Jennifer had no comprehension of whatsoever. People make a catastrophic mistake when they confuse silence with weakness. They assume that someone who doesn't fight back vocally, who doesn't create drama, who stays quiet and composed, must be passive or powerless. But silence is actually one of the most effective weapons you can wield if you know how to use it properly. It's a blade that people don't see coming until it's already drawn blood. And Jennifer had just provided me with the perfect justification to sharpen that blade and use it with absolute precision. The truth that Jennifer never grasped, that nobody in that ballroom could have understood, was this. While she'd been climbing her corporate ladder over the past several years, networking aggressively, schmoozing clients at expensive lunches, positioning herself as this rising star consultant, I'd been engaged in something completely different, something she never noticed because she'd fundamentally stopped paying any real attention to what I was doing. She saw me as background scenery, a stagnant figure who existed in her peripheral vision but had no agency or significance. For the past 7 months, while Jennifer genuinely believed I was researching investment portfolio strategies and market trends as some kind of boring hobby, I was actually constructing a comprehensive, meticulously documented case against her company's vendor relationships and her role in creating them. I'd been tracking suspicious contract approval patterns, mapping procurement process irregularities that shouldn't exist in any legitimate business relationship, following money trails and timeline correlations that raised serious compliance questions. There was this mid-tier cybersecurity firm called Sentinel Tech Solutions that kept appearing in my analysis. On paper, on the surface level that most people would examine, they were completely unremarkable. Just another vendor in a crowded, competitive market trying to sell security infrastructure services. But if you took the time to actually scratch beneath that surface, to follow the connections and trace the corporate structures, you'd discover something genuinely fascinating and deeply problematic. Their subcontractors had direct financial and operational connections to Jennifer's consulting firm. Multiple layers of corporate entities that on the surface appeared separate but were actually interconnected through shared ownership stakes and board memberships. And somehow, through what Jennifer would characterize as her exceptional salesmanship and strategic thinking, Sentinel Tech went from being one minor vendor among literally dozens competing for our company's business to becoming our exclusive preferred security provider in less than 3 months. The normal timeline for that kind of vendor status elevation is typically 12 to 18 months of performance evaluation and competitive bidding. They did it in under 90 days. The timeline correlations were absolutely fascinating from an analytical perspective. Every single quarter that Sentinel Tech's service fees increased, and they increased 3 quarters consecutively by significant margins. It coincided with perfect timing to Jennifer's firm pushing for expanded security infrastructure projects at our company. I had spreadsheets mapping the correlation with color-coded cells showing the overlap. I had email chains with precise timestamps showing internal discussions about security vendor selections happening before those selections were even officially opened for competitive bidding. I had communications, preserved and documented, where Jennifer casually mentioned having advanced visibility and inside access to procurement timing in messages to colleagues. She'd been careless because she was arrogant. She genuinely believed that nobody was watching carefully enough to notice the patterns, and she was absolutely certain that her boring, stagnant husband, who couldn't even manage to get promoted after more than a decade, was not paying any attention whatsoever to her professional activities. That was her fatal miscalculation. The car ride home that night was filled with total silence, except for the rhythmic sound of Jennifer's perfectly manicured fingernails tapping against her phone screen. She was scrolling through photographs from the event that people were already posting on social media, checking who had tagged her in their posts, calculating her visibility and impact, basking in what she perceived as the successful afterglow of her performance. Finally, about 10 minutes into the drive, she broke the silence with a dismissive laugh. "Come on, don't be so dramatic and sensitive. It was obviously just a joke. Nobody actually cared or took it seriously." I didn't answer. Didn't even turn my head in her direction. Just watched the streetlights flicker past in regular intervals, each one briefly illuminating her reflection in the passenger side window. She looked smug, oblivious, completely unaware that she'd just handed me the final piece of justification I needed. When we pulled into our driveway, she didn't wait for any interaction or acknowledgement. Grabbed her designer clutch, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement as she headed directly toward the house, without a single backward glance. No good night. No attempt at reconciliation, no acknowledgement that anything might be wrong. Just disappeared inside like I was a chauffeur who'd completed his designated task. I followed slowly, deliberately, like someone carefully counting their steps through a known minefield. I could hear her routine beginning immediately once we were inside, the shower running in the master bathroom. A phone call to her sister where she recounted her promotion joke, like it was absolutely hilarious comedy material worthy of professional stand-up, her laughter echoing through the bedroom door. I removed my jacket with care, hung it properly in the hall closet, and walked directly to my home office. Closed the door behind me, turned the lock. Then I moved the filing cabinet aside. Behind it was a shelf that Jennifer had never touched, never examined, never shown the slightest interest in during our entire 15 years of marriage. She used to make jokes about how I organized files like a detective working a criminal investigation, instead of like a normal corporate analyst. She meant it as an insult, as mockery of what she perceived as my excessive, obsessive nature. She was more accurate than she realized. I reached for a thick, hardbound report with no visible label on the spine. Just a title embossed in understated gold lettering on the dark leather cover: Vendor Compliance and Enterprise Risk Assessment. Comprehensive Internal Analysis. Inside those pages were 7 months of absolutely meticulous, obsessive work. Patterns I'd identified through hundreds of hours of analysis. Vendor irregularities documented with forensic precision. Compliance blind spots that nobody else had noticed, or perhaps that certain people had deliberately chosen not to see. Transactional anomalies and timeline correlations that told an extremely clear story if you had the patience and analytical skill to read them properly. And one name appearing far, far too frequently in far too many questionable contexts. Sentinel Tech Solutions. With Jennifer's fingerprints all over the approval processes, I'd mapped every single connection with the thoroughness of someone building a legal case. The subcontractors with documented ties to Jennifer's consulting firm. The suspicious, statistically improbable timing of cost increases that always seemed to benefit Sentinel Tech. The way our company's security spending budgets mysteriously ballooned by 41% in the exact same quarter that Jennifer's firm started aggressively pushing Sentinel Tech for preferred vendor status across 5 different operational departments. This wasn't paranoia or conspiracy thinking. This was pure documentation, because numbers don't lie, even when the people creating them do. I turned to a specific appendix section, carefully folded one particular page that showed the vendor approval decision flowchart, illustrating exactly how our internal security spending had surged in direct, undeniable correlation with Jennifer's firm's involvement in our procurement processes. Slid it into a plain manila envelope. Wrote one name on the front in clear block letters: M. Harrison, Board of Directors. Then I unlocked my bottom desk drawer and retrieved a USB drive that had been sitting there for weeks. No label, no identifying marking, just a cryptic date embedded in its encrypted file name structure. This drive had never been connected to any cloud backup service, never synced to any network server, never copied or duplicated. Because if anyone had discovered it before I was strategically ready to deploy it, the entire carefully constructed plan would have detonated prematurely before I could control the narrative and the consequences. I composed an email with surgical precision. Subject line: critical material risk exposure requiring immediate board-level review and response. The body text was deliberately, strategically brief. I didn't explain everything because I didn't need to provide a complete narrative. The attached document would communicate everything that needed to be said. It was designed specifically to convey information through visual data representation, through risk assessment heat maps with color-coded threat levels, through procurement pathway flow diagrams showing the connections, through timestamped compliance flags that created an undeniable timeline. I'd actually spent more total hours formatting and designing the visual presentation than I'd spent writing the analytical content, because I understood that board members would only skim written text, but they would actually study visual data that clearly illustrated problems. I hit the send button at precisely 6:41 the next morning. No dramatic moment of hesitation, no cinematic pause. Just clicked the button with my mouse and watched the message disappear into the digital communication infrastructure. Then, I systematically and methodically deleted the file from my computer's hard drive, cleared the recent document access cache, ran a military-grade security wipe program twice to ensure complete data removal, and shut everything down exactly like nothing significant had happened. By the time Jennifer woke up for her usual morning yoga class and green smoothie routine, that email had already been opened and read by 3 different board members. There were no immediate replies, no urgent follow-up messages, no phone calls, just silence spreading through the executive level. But that particular silence meant everything to someone who understood how corporate power actually operates. Because once people in genuine positions of authority and decision-making power see evidence like what I'd compiled and presented, they fundamentally cannot ignore it. They face only 2 possible paths: either take decisive action to address the documented problems, or become actively complicit in covering up potential fraud and regulatory violations. And neither of those options ended favorably for Jennifer. I went to the office that morning exactly like any other Tuesday in 13 years, smiled pleasantly at Rebecca working the reception desk, took the elevator to my designated floor, opened my standard spreadsheets and analytical models, responded to routine emails about quarterly projections. Just another unremarkably boring day for an unremarkably boring analyst who'd been inexplicably stuck in the same position for more than a decade. Then, at 8:23 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a calendar notification. Emergency executive board meeting scheduled for 10:30. My name was specifically listed as required attendance, which was genuinely unusual and unprecedented because mid-level analysts essentially never receive invitations to board-level meetings under any normal circumstances. When I walked into that top-floor conference room exactly 2 hours and 7 minutes later, I knew immediately that the wheels I'd set in motion were now turning with unstoppable momentum. The energy in the room was completely different from any normal meeting, charged with something tense and urgent and barely controlled. My direct supervisor, Darren, looked physically ill, his face pale and sweating despite the aggressive air conditioning. The VP of Operations was typing frantically on his laptop, barely acknowledging anyone's presence or the fact that the meeting was starting. Mr. Harrison entered the room last. No briefcase, no preparation materials, no preliminary small talk or social pleasantries. He walked directly to his position at the head of the long conference table, placed a printed and bound copy of my complete report on the polished wood surface, with a soft but definitive thud that somehow silenced all remaining conversation, and said simply, clearly, "Let's begin immediately." What followed over the next 90 minutes wasn't chaos or uncontrolled accusations or emotional reactions. It was surgical, methodical analysis conducted by people who understood exactly what they were examining. They proceeded through the document page by careful page, section by detailed section, how Sentinel Tech had somehow jumped from Tier 3 vendor status to exclusive preferred provider within 90 days, which represented roughly 1/6 of the normal timeline for that level of vendor relationship elevation, how their monthly billing had increased by 41% over 3 consecutive quarters, without any corresponding documentable increase in service deliverables, scope expansion, or performance improvements. how internal security system firewall alerts and compliance flags had been manually overridden during 3 major infrastructure implementations, all of which Jennifer had helped coordinate and approve through her firm's consulting engagement with our company. Then Marcus, our head of legal and compliance, tapped deliberately on one specific printed email that appeared in the appendix documentation. An internal communication summary from Jennifer's consulting firm that explicitly referenced anticipated approvals from inside sources with advanced visibility and strategic asset positioning aligned with pre-contract confirmation timelines. The language wasn't overtly criminal in a way that would immediately trigger legal prosecution, but it was absolutely undeniably damning in its implications. It suggested advanced knowledge of confidential procurement information. It implied insider access to decision-making processes. It demonstrated coordination between an external consulting firm and internal company procurement that should never exist in any legitimate business relationship operating under proper compliance standards. The room had gone completely silent when Mr. Harrison's executive assistant quietly entered, approached him, and handed him a phone. He glanced at the screen, his expression remaining completely unreadable and professionally neutral, and answered the call with a single word. "Yes." Brief pause. Then, in a voice that had somehow become harder, colder, more steel-like, "No, she was not authorized to have that information." Confirmed definitively. Another pause while he listened. Then quieter, but paradoxically even more threatening in its controlled tone. "Have her brought in for questioning today." He handed the phone back to his assistant without breaking eye contact with the rest of us and turned his attention to Marcus. "Initiate comprehensive joint review procedures between both companies immediately. Full forensic audit protocols, effective as of this moment." At that precise instant, occurring simultaneously 3 floors down in a glass and steel tower building on the other side of the city, Jennifer's phone started ringing insistently. Her boss, a perpetually anxious man named Warren who essentially ran on caffeine and chronic stress, was pacing back and forth in front of his office window overlooking the financial district. "What did you do, Jennifer? What the hell did you do?" His voice was strained, tight with barely suppressed panic. Jennifer was still in her silk designer pajamas, her morning coffee cup suspended halfway to her lips. "What are you talking about? I literally just woke up 15 minutes ago." "There's an emergency board meeting happening right now at DataCore Corporation. They're naming you specifically by name. Something about critical risk exposure related to Sentinel Tech vendor relationships and insider access." She actually laughed out loud, genuinely amused. "That's completely ridiculous. I haven't done anything remotely wrong or inappropriate. This is obviously some kind of misunderstanding." "They have extensive documentation, Jennifer." Warren's voice dropped lower. "Names, transactional patterns, timeline correlations, email communications. Your name is directly connected to vendor recommendation processes and internal access to procurement information that shouldn't exist. Multiple board members are involved. This isn't going away." The silence that stretched across the phone connection was profound. "They're requiring you to come in for formal questioning," Warren added, even quieter now, almost sympathetic. This morning, legal is already setting up the interview room." The call terminated abruptly. Back in our boardroom, Mr. Harrison stood with deliberate finality. "We'll take a 30-minute recess for preliminary consultation. Marcus, Richard, you will remain here. Everyone else is excused." The room emptied quickly, people practically fleeing toward the doors, grateful for any excuse to escape the tension. Marcus from legal finally looked directly at me for the first time since the meeting began. "Is there additional supporting material we should be aware of? Anything beyond what you've already provided?" I met his gaze with absolute steadiness. "There's a secondary documentation file. More detailed transaction records with complete timeline mapping and additional communication evidence." Mr. Harrison's jaw flexed almost imperceptibly. "Provide everything immediately. No thank you. No handshake, no false social pleasantries or gratitude." Because they understood something now with complete clarity that Jennifer had never ever grasped throughout our entire marriage. I hadn't compiled this documentation out of some abstract sense of corporate duty or compliance responsibility. I'd done it with precision, with extraordinary patience, with the kind of methodical strategic planning that requires months of consistent effort and absolute commitment to a specific outcome. By noon, Jennifer was sitting in her firm's legal compliance office, facing their stern-faced general counsel while they systematically walked her through printed copies of emails, her own emails that she'd written and sent, electronic messages with timestamps that exactly matched procurement decisions and contract approvals, communications where she'd casually, carelessly joked about having advanced lockdown access and used unprofessional language about confidential inside information like it was completely normal and acceptable business behavior. She tried calling me 4 times in the first hour alone, 12 times total by the end of the business day, texts that went from confused to angry to desperate. I didn't answer any of them, didn't even read most of them. By Wednesday morning, Jennifer's name was actively circulating through industry blogs, professional networking sites, and insider corporate gossip channels. Not yet full-blown mainstream scandal coverage with headlines, just the preliminary whispers that always precede major career destruction. Phrases like under serious internal review and administrative leave pending comprehensive investigation. Someone had leaked a photograph of her leaving her firm's office building, not escorted by uniformed security, but by someone from the legal department wearing an expensive suit. No handcuffs, no dramatic perp walk, just a formerly confident woman carrying a small cardboard box of personal desk items, wearing oversized sunglasses, walking into a completely uncertain future while someone documented it with their phone camera. Thursday morning at exactly 7:04, I opened my work email to find a message marked with high priority urgent status. Subject line, critical organizational restructuring announcement, immediate implementation. By 7:32, every single employee at DataCore Corporation had received the identical communication. Effective immediately as of today's date, Richard Matthews is appointed to the newly created position of Executive Director of Enterprise Risk Management and Compliance Oversight. This division will report directly and exclusively to the Board of Directors and will operate with complete independence from all traditional management hierarchies and departmental structures. There was no preliminary meeting to announce the change, no press release distributed to media, no company-wide gathering or town hall presentation, just one quiet, definitive email that fundamentally restructured the entire power architecture of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. I wasn't being promoted to some slightly better middle management position with a moderately improved title and a small salary increase. I was being handed genuine, substantial authority. The kind of institutional power that doesn't have supervisors constantly looking over your shoulder and questioning your decisions, because you report exclusively to the people who have the authority to terminate those supervisors. By Friday afternoon, I was in a brand new office, 32nd floor, corner spot, floor-to-ceiling windows showing the entire city. Soundproof walls meant I could talk about anything without being overheard. I now had open access to every department's financial records, operations data, and compliance files. I could talk directly to legal and the board without anyone filtering or approving my messages. That afternoon in the executive hallway, Mr. Harrison passed by. He didn't slow down or stop, just gave me that sharp, knowing nod, the same one from the gala, and said quietly, "Don't tell anyone what you're doing. Don't explain. Just do it." At home, Jennifer hadn't spoken to me in 5 days. When she finally did, she was different. All the power and certainty she'd worn like armor were gone. What was left was fear, anger, and a shaky kind of pleading. "They shut off my access," she said, standing in the kitchen, still in the outfit she wore to her termination meeting. Her voice was thin and flat. "My badge doesn't work. My email's gone. They gave me separation papers like I was a criminal." I made tea slowly, saying nothing. "This was you," she snapped. "You fed them lies. You're punishing me for what I said at the gala. You're trying to destroy my career." Without a word, I walked to the cabinet over the wine rack, reached behind her expensive wine bottles, and pulled out a sealed folder. I'd prepared and notarized it 4 months earlier. I set it down in front of her carefully. She looked at it like it might catch fire. "What is this supposed to be?" Her voice wavered. I stirred my tea and stayed silent. She ripped the folder open. Inside was a single printed email. Her email. Her words. The line about inside access isn't just corporate metaphor. We actually have it. The full message header sat below it, showing internal routing and the exact time it was sent. Beneath that was the notarization from an outside service. Proof I'd preserved the evidence long before anyone started asking questions. Her hands shook as she stared at her own words, like she didn't even recognize them. "You kept this," she whispered. The fight in her voice was gone. You planned this. You waited. The kitchen was silent, heavy. It was just office talk, she tried. Jokes. It's out of context. It doesn't prove anything. It proves everything, I finally said, calm and flat. When someone with inside access is feeding vendor partners early information on contracts and procurement timelines. She sank onto a stool, still holding the paper like a death notice. The polished professional mask she wore so well was cracking fast. You're ending my career, she whispered. You're destroying everything I built. I said nothing, just poured my tea, washed the cup, dried it. She looked up with a mix of rage and pleading. I gave everything to this partnership, and you're burning it down over one email, over one deal? I built something real. You don't get to destroy it because your ego got bruised at a gala. I faced her fully. You didn't build anything real, Jennifer. You borrowed other people's trust. You stole it. And some of us kept careful records. I folded the towel neatly. For the first time in 16 years, Jennifer had nothing to say. No clever line, no spin, no denial, just silence. Saturday morning came with the usual fall weather. I drank black coffee, walked quietly to get the mail, and smelled that late October mix of wet leaves and far-off wood smoke that says winter is near. At 7:16 a.m., I opened my email and found something that changed the whole day. It was an internal note from corporate HR. The subject line read, Executive Appointment Confirmation and Transition Details. By 8:45, former top execs were calling one another, trying to make sense of what had happened overnight. By 9:30, the company chat and Slack were blowing up with guesses, rumors, and some accurate leaks. By 10 o'clock, every team at DataCore knew their world had shifted for good. Jennifer's name started circling in the wrong places. Industry lists, trade newsletters, office gossip chains. Not a TV scandal yet, but the kind of hush talk that follows people in tight industries. Words like serious compliance issues and pending external audit stuck to her name. At home, the house felt empty, like a room with a ghost. Jennifer moved through the rooms without aim. She stopped calling, stopped trying to explain or defend herself. She just existed in a strange, paused place between her old life and an unknown future. I got back late Saturday afternoon and saw a manila envelope on the entry table. No courier, no postmark, just there as if placed by hand. Inside were complete divorce papers, filed 3 days earlier, signed by me, stamped by the county clerk. On top of the stack was a short note in my handwriting. I was never the person holding you back from anything. No name, no note, just that line. Her wedding ring lay on the kitchen counter, face down, dropped with no ceremony. She'd left without packing clothes or things, likely at her sister's or in a hotel, trying to hold on to denial for a bit longer. Late that night, she sent one last text. You won completely. Just please don't make this public. It will ruin what's left of me. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to ruin. Her career had been built on borrowed trust, favors, inside access, ties that weren't legitimately hers. When those props fell away, nothing real was left. On Monday, the board met again. Marcus from legal raised the option of suing Jennifer personally. Civil claims, damages, professional liability. We have full paperwork for multiple causes of action, he said, looking at me. If you want personal damages, we can move fast and press hard. Every head at the table turned to me, waiting for the call. I shook my head. No, I don't want money. I don't want press. I don't want to give her a stage to tell her side. Marcus snapped his leather folder shut. We'll log everything and archive the case file. That was that. No grand speeches, no public triumph, just a record that the matter was handled and closed. What I learned was simple. Real revenge isn't loud or flashy like in the movies. It's steady, patient, careful, and often looks exactly like doing your job well. Jennifer had thought she was married to someone soft and passive, someone she could shame in public with no real fallout. She was wrong. She was married to someone who knew silence wasn't weakness. It was a position. Someone who could wait for the right moment and act with exactness. The cruelest thing isn't a big public takedown. It's letting someone crumble under their own choices while you quietly record every step, then showing the facts at the perfect time. That's what I did, and I'd do it again.